Well, I tell you, there are some things that when you do what I do, you go to some places and by the time you have your first service, you feel like you've been there a week. You're ready to load up and get on down the road, and then there are other times that you come to the end and you wonder where the time has gone. And this time, I don't know what God is doing. But He is, I mean, if you haven't felt it, I'm telling you, I don't know. I can't remember being part of a meeting like this in a long time. Most places I go, you all would have been scaring them to death by now. I'm telling you, I don't know what God is trying to do, but I would hate to be the one that kept it from happening. Did you hear what I just said? I don't know what God is trying to do because it's obvious that He is doing something. And I would hate to be the one that kept it from happening. There are a lot of people that would disagree with me on this. In fact, I've taken some heat over the years for talking about how disobedience can hinder the work of God, because we do talk about how God is all-powerful and He can do whatever He wants to do. But it's amazing to me that an all-powerful God has limited Himself by the responses of His people. A God that can do whatever He wants to do has chosen to limit Himself by the choices that you and I make. It's an incredible thing. And there have been times in my life that I've been close to Him, that I felt Him moving. And then there have been other times when I've been good on acting like I was close to Him and acting like that I felt Him moving. But in my heart and in my mind, I knew I was just as far as I had ever been. I've been there, and you can judge me if you want to, but probably most of y'all have been there as well. And I just have to repeat myself from last night. If you are here and you're not right with Him, what are you waiting for? I mean, honestly, what are you waiting for? He's given us another opportunity to get right. And why would you not take advantage of that opportunity that He's given? I think about my life, and I really want to do what the Lord would have me to do. And I'm telling you, I don't know what God is trying to do, but I think about my life and my journey. And if you've been here, I mentioned on Sunday morning that I grew up through my 8th grade year going to my papa's church in Wofford, Kentucky, just over here in Whitley County. On the weekends, we would go down there, and then in the 8th grade, some things happened in my life and my family's life that just kind of made me mad, and I decided that I was going to stop going to church. I don't know if you've ever thought you were old enough to make that decision or not, but I decided that I was done. I laid out of church for about 2 years. I was a sophomore in high school, and I was in a musical at the school that I was going to in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was an underclassman, and there was a girl that was in the 11th grade, an upperclassman, that I just thought was beautiful. I had to check myself because I started to say she was hot, but some of y'all might not appreciate that, But she was beautiful. Her name was Lana, and I wanted to impress Lana. I wanted to make her mine. But everything I did seemed to serve the purpose. I think I annoyed her more than I did impress her. And besides that, she was dating the lead of the play, which happened to be a senior. And so I didn't get very far, but I was there after rehearsal one day, and I was just hanging around the auditorium, and Lana was up on the stage. Everybody else had gone. And I began to make my way up to the front to where the stage was, and as I got halfway up there, I noticed that Lana was crying. And it made me excited. I'm just going to be honest with you. It did. I got excited about that. Why? Because I thought, here's my chance. I can find out what's bothering her. I can sweep in. I can be her knight in shining armor. And she won't help but fall in love with me. You guys know how that... I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that her purse had been stolen. And I didn't really see what the big deal was. I didn't carry one, but she was pretty upset about it. And so I said, don't worry about it, Lana. I will find your purse. And I'll never forget that day because it was raining. It was pouring the rain. I went outside the school there, and my high school had about 1,400 students. Our junior high, our middle school, had about 1,200 students. And if you've ever been around that many people, you know that the garbage cans isn't one place for any living thing to be digging around in. But I just thought maybe somebody had tossed her purse in there. So I remember out in the rain, going through the trash, didn't find it. I went through all the garbage cans that I could look in. It wasn't there. I looked behind all the landscaping, all that kind of thing. Never did find her purse, but Lana gave me a ride home that day in her lime green Chevette. How many of y'all remember Chevette? We try to forget, but they take a licking and they keep on ticking, you know, all that kind of thing. She gave me a ride home, and when we got to my house where I lived, as I opened the door, before my feet could touch the pavement, Lana asked me a question. She said, Billy, what are you doing tonight? And obviously, I didn't find her purse, but I thought to myself, I succeeded in impressing her, or at least she feels sorry for me because she asked me that question. So without hesitating, I said, nothing, why? Probably seemed a little overly anxious. She said to me, well, my church is having revival. Do you want to go? Now, I'll be as honest as I can with you. The last place I wanted to go with Lana was church. I could care less about church. I had tried that at my papaw's church. I had seen the way people had treated my papaw. I saw the way life would turn out for things. But my mind began to do the arithmetic, my sophomore mind, and I began to think, you know, if I go to church with Lana, I might get to sit with her. And if I sit with Lana, my knee might touch her knee. I might get to pass a note, or I might get to put my arm around her, whatever it may be. So I said, without even asking where it was, I said, sure, I'll go. Well, she picked me up that night, and we ended up going to the First Church of the Nazarene in Norwood, Ohio. Now, I didn't know anything about the Church of the Nazarene. The only thing that I had heard about the Church of the Nazarene was that they were a bunch of holy rollers. Now, don't be offended by that. They don't call us that anymore. Maybe that should offend you. But I was familiar a little bit with this church because it's set on Floral Avenue. And I had friends that lived on Floral Avenue, so it was an old-fashioned holiness church, and so it was in the day, it was 1987, and it was in the day where they still played the organ and the piano, and so I remember being at my friend's place, and every now and then we would hear the music playing, and they had these fake stained glass windows, not pretty like these over here, but just the ugly plastic ones that were just, if you've got those in your church, I apologize. I'm just saying they were those fake, they're very obviously fake, and so what we would do, we only did it a few times, but when that music would start, me and my friends would go over there and we would tap on the windows because we knew that if we tapped enough, they would come out and chase us. The ushers would, and they were old and we were young. They were slow. We could outrun them. And so we did that from time to time. That's the only association that I had with that church. They knew me for that reason, and had I known that was the place where we were going to go to church that night, I probably would have told Lana no. Because that was also the place where the lead of the play went to church. Her boyfriend, and not only did he go to church there, his dad was the pastor. But we pulled in. We pulled in, and I couldn't chicken out. It's too much of a man for that. You know, Dad always said, act brave, whether you are or not. They won't know the difference. And so we went into the foyer, and my pastor was a man named Morris Chalfant. And Pastor Chalfant was probably 6'4". He was a big athletic guy. He was in his mid-60s at that point. He was the kind of guy that with the youth group there, he would play tennis with us, and he'd play in his polyester dress pants and his long sleeve shirt, but we wouldn't dare make fun of him because he beat us. And he was an athlete. He was very strong, and he saw me come into the foyer. He knew that I had knocked on those windows before, and all of a sudden he started walking very quickly toward me, and I got a little bit nervous because my dad is from the hills of Southeast Kentucky. My dad was raised with an iron fist, and he raised us with an iron fist, and I just knew that he was either going to throw me out or give me exactly what I deserved. But I couldn't run because I wanted to impress Lana. He reached out and he grabbed my hand, almost with as big as hands as you got, brother. Reached out and grabbed my hand, and he shook it. And this is what he said. He said, "Billy, I'm glad that you're here." Now that doesn't sound like a lot to you, but to a 15-year-old boy who deserved to be thrown out of that place, that meant a lot to me. Went into the sanctuary, and it was the kind that had a middle aisle, two rows of seating like this, two aisles of seating over here. I started to get in the back there because that's where I'd always sit with the youth group before, but I noticed that Lana came down here, and the youth group sat in the first 4 or 5 rows, and if I wanted to sit with Lana, I had to go down there. And so I'm sitting there with her when the musicians began. Now, they didn't bring in Rising Sun Ministries. That would have really been something. I have really enjoyed. Do you appreciate Rising Sun Ministry? I have really, really enjoyed them this week. They have ushered in the Spirit, and it's made it easy to preach, and that makes a difference. But they had brought in some song evangelists that some of you might know the name, Jim and Rosemary Green. They had traveled around in the Church of the Nazarene a whole lot. She would play the organ loudly. He would stand. He wasn't as tall as the pulpit was, but he would stand there and beller about blowing a trumpet in Zion, and he'd clap his hands. Their hair was as black as coal. They were as old as dirt. I don't know how that worked. When they were done, the preacher got up to preach. I'd never heard anything like it before. He was a man by the name of Dick Strickland. I don't know if any of you recognize that name or not. He was a very colorful man. He would say things like down to down, down, down. And when I say colorful, he had some funny red shade hair. I don't know what box that came out of. Probably should have stayed on the shelf. Oh, loosen up, would you? If I had some hair, I would color it. And some of you did notice, thank you for noticing, I did have a haircut today. He got up and preached, and it got my attention. I'd never seen anything like that before. And when he was done, all of a sudden, Jim and Rosemary got up, and they began to sing, and I watched as people stood up from all over the sanctuary, and they began to make their way down to this thing here. Now, I'm not being disrespectful. We didn't have these at Papal's church. I really thought, I know it's an altar now, but I thought this was a beating bench. I really did, because I would watch. It was an old-fashioned holiness church. I would watch as people would come down and kneel there, and then the beaters would gather in around them. And in their hands, I mean, it looked like they were beating the sin out of them. They were shouting. They were yelling. They were crying. I'm telling you, brother, it was better than television. It got my attention. I went back night after night after night. And on the last night of revival, I don't know why I waited until then, but on the last night, I knew I needed what these people had. I knew I needed what they had. I didn't understand it, but I knew I needed it. So I made my way from my seat down to the beating bench, fully expecting the beaters to come in and to do their... Because remember, my father, I said, ruled things by an iron fist. You looked at my dad wrong, and he would give you the back of his hand. Now, don't judge him for that. That's the only way he knew. It didn't kill me. I had a healthy respect or fear for my dad that I believe some of our kids need to have for their fathers nowadays. You know. But anyhow, I'd always heard God referred to as Father. And so I did, and I knew that there were some things that my dad didn't know I had done that he knew about, and I deserved it. But what I received, Pastor, is not what I deserved. Because I remember feeling two arms wrap around me. Now you wouldn't have been able to see them, but I felt them. They were the arms of the Father. I hugged my dad one time before he died. That's the kind of family I came from. But this night, I felt the arms of the Father wrapped around me. And I heard my Father's voice whispering in my ear, not my earthly father, but my heavenly Father, telling me how much He loved me. Telling me that He'd always loved me. When I was blaming Him for things that had happened, He hadn't done it. And when I was trying to run, He had been there the whole time, that He would always be there, that His love would never... I'm telling you, that was the night I was saved. And by the way, can I just tell you, I still believe you must be born again. I go to some places nowadays and I talk about being saved, and they look at you like you're from some time past, that it's an unintelligent thing to say. But I believe church membership is not enough. I believe having a family name is not enough. I don't think confirmation is enough, nor affirmation. I believe you must have that moment of salvation when you realize that you were lost in your sin. You understood the provision that He made when He hung on a tree, when He shed His blood, and you accepted the free gift that He offers to all. I believe you must be born again. And if you're here tonight and you're not saved, I don't know what you're waiting for. He has brought you here tonight to let you know how much He loves you, and you can be born again before you leave this place. But that was the night I was saved, and it made a difference in my life. It did. I decided right then and there it was real. Do you remember what it felt like when you understood how much He loved you? Do you remember that night when you were saved? Man, I decided that I would be the best Christian that I could possibly be. I started going to church regularly, started going to youth group. I love youth group. I found out at that time that there was a translation other than the King James Version. I grew up thinking that the King James Version was the only version there was. I really did. I thought Jesus carried the King James Version. Some of you still think that. That's all right. That's all right. You have proof on television. Every time you hear Jesus speaking, He's always speaking with a thick British accent. Why a Middle Eastern man has a thick British accent, I don't know, but He's speaking the King's English. Now, if you get offended over that, you're a small person. I'm just kidding around. But I began to realize that there were other translations, which, by the way, there's enough gospel in all the translations. If we would just believe it, we could save the world. I started reading the Word of God, began going to church, and when I got close to graduation, William, I knew that the Lord wanted me to go to a Christian university. Believed that He had placed a call on my life. I didn't know how it would happen, but God had put two on my heart, either Trevecca or Olivet Nazarene University. And I don't know if you've ever looked at how expensive these places are, but they're not cheap. And my family was a blue-collar family. Dad worked for General Motors. Mom worked for Bicycle Playing Cards there in Norwood, Ohio. And they made too much money for me to get any help, but not enough money to be able to pay my way through college. But I knew God wanted me to go. And so I just really learned that where He leads, He'll provide. And you hold on to that, William. Where He leads, He will provide. I went to Olivet because that's where God had for me to go. And I just want to tell you one more thing. I don't know how it happened, but the bill was paid. It was worth every penny. And I went. I went. In my freshman year, I felt like God was calling me into the ministry. But I didn't want to. Can I be honest? I didn't want to. Because I had seen the heart my papaw had for those people. I also saw the way those people treated my papaw. I saw the love that he had for, but I also stayed in the trailer that he called home that was outside in the field next to the church. And there's nothing wrong with the trailer, but I wish you could see this one. I rode around in the little rusted out cars that Papaw drove around in. Papaw would have loved to have had Lana's lime green Chevette. But he wasn't blessed to have that. Instead, he made do with what he had. And you know what? If I was paying that much for school, I wanted a better life than that. And so I made a deal with God. I don't recommend it. But I did. I said, this is the direction I'm going to go until you show me different. Until you show me for certain I'm hard-headed. That this is what you want me to do. I'm going to go and I'm going to teach music. And so it didn't take him long. My spring semester, freshman year, it was 1991, Olivet Nazarene University. There was a preacher there holding revival. His name was Gary Henneke. And that night, during that revival in 1991, God made clear that He was calling me into the field of evangelism. Very clear. He didn't call me to be a pastor. I couldn't put up with you, and you couldn't put up with me. I mean that. You really couldn't put up with me. But He called me into evangelism. I would say that was my moment of surrender. That last little bit that I was trying to hold on to, I relinquished. I gave to Him, and He gave me so much more. But I went back to my room, and I began to write out a testimony. I don't know any of you all journal or anything like that. I don't, but that night I did. I sat down, and by the light of my desk lamp, I began to write what God had done in my life. I began to say things like, I can't wait to tell Papaw that I'm going to be a preacher. I can't wait to let my mom know what I'm going to do with the future. I can't wait to tell my friends how Jesus has made a difference in my life. I can't wait because I know He can make a difference. I said things like this, David. I said, I won't let man discourage me. I won't answer to any church board. I won't let them. God, you're my boss. I'll go where you want me to go. I'll do what you want me to do. You have called me. You will provide. I was excited. That was in 1991. Now, a couple of years ago, I was at home, and I'm now 43, so a couple of years ago, I was either 40, 41 years old. I was in my room where my books were, in my office area. I looked over at my bookshelves, and I saw that some of my books were out of place. And if you've been here this week, I've made different mentions at different times. I'm obsessive compulsive. I'm not saying that in a cute way. I was diagnosed as a little boy, used to take medication for all that kind of thing. In my life, everything has a place. There's an order to things, and it's hard for me to get out of that order. And I looked over at my bookshelf, and there were some books out of place. And at that time, I didn't understand why they were out of place, because the only ones that would have been in there were my dogs. And I didn't know my dogs could read. They're just little Shih Tzus. I don't know how they got up on that shelf anyhow. But I couldn't take it because the book was out of place and it needed to be put back in the right place. So I got up to move that book. I'm hard to live with. I got up to move that book, and it was this big blue book. I probably hadn't used it since college. It was a comparative study Bible. It had about 5 translations in it. I pulled that book out, and when I pulled that book out of the shelf, this green piece of paper flew out and hit the floor. And that bothered me even more, because I don't put papers in my books. Because papers don't belong in books, because if you put them in books, it's going to end up on the floor, and papers really don't belong on the floor. And so I reached over and I grabbed that piece of paper, and it was the testimony that I had written out in 1991. And I'm going to be very honest with you. As I stood there and read what I had written as an 18-year-old boy, I could sense the enthusiasm. I could sense the excitement, the determination to do what God had called me to do. And then all of a sudden, as a 40-year-old man, I begin to get convicted. Because if I were very transparent with you, as a 40-year-old man, I wasn't as excited as I was as an 18-year-old boy. And I don't know why. I've tried to figure it out, Dave. I don't know if it was from working in the church, because I told you the other night, until I worked in the church as a youth pastor after college, I just thought that the Church of the Nazarene was a place that people got together that loved Jesus and loved each other. And then when I worked there for 3 years, I saw how it really worked. I don't know if it was all the revivals that I had been holding. I used to get excited when I'd preached to as few as 4 people. And it didn't matter, I'd get excited about it. I mean, one of those 4 was me. I'd go, and it was something. But now, that's many years ago. Now, I'm just going to be, I don't know why the excitement was gone. I don't know why the determination, the enthusiasm wasn't there. All I knew, through the prompting of the Holy Spirit, that if I was going to be the man that He had called me to be, if I were going to have the ministry that He intended for me to have, then I was going to have to take care of some things. And I want to ask you a question, because I don't believe that you're here by accident tonight. I have enough confidence in Him to believe that He has brought all of us here for a purpose. And I'm going to be very blunt with you. I'm going to be very straightforward. I want to know tonight, how is your relationship with Jesus? I don't care how old you are. I don't care how young you are. How is your relationship with Him? Do you have one? Now remember, we're not talking about church attendance, because you can come to church and be far from Him. I'm not talking about all the ins and outs. You can check all the right boxes and you can still wake up in hell. You can have a bun on your head and have a whole lot of carnality twisted in that bun. Do you have a relationship with Him? Have you been saved? I believe probably most of us have been. So here's the question that I want to ask you. Are you closer tonight than you have ever been? Remember when it was. Are you more passionate about Jesus than you ever have been? Are you more determined about sharing His love with a world that needs to know Him than you ever have been? Or have you known better days? Because here's the fact. If you're not as close as you've ever been, you've got a problem. It's not your preacher's problem. It's not a worship style's problem. Hey, it's not even culture's problem. It's your problem. Because we determined on Sunday morning that everything you needed has been provided. You can have as much of Jesus as you want. So I wonder, how much do you want of Him? And I think it's all right that I'm blunt with you. Because all throughout, I'm tired of people saying, well, you've got to earn the right to do this. I'll tell you where my right comes from. Based upon the Word of God, I have the authority to look you in the eye and ask you those questions. I may not know where you're living, but He has sent me to confront you. And all throughout the Old Testament, all throughout the Old, He used the prophets to look His people in the eye and say, hey, you know you're not living the way you ought to be living. You know you're not doing what you ought to be doing. You need to straighten up and fly right. I'm thankful that God used a group of strange men to confront His people. Why? Because if God can use strange men then, He can use strange men now. He can use even stranger. I mean, if God can speak through a donkey, then surely He can speak through Billy Huddleston. All throughout the Old Testament, he used those people. When you get in the New Testament, we've talked about him. It doesn't take long until you run into a guy named Paul. And you remember Paul, don't you? He's the author of 2/3 of our New Testament, early church father. But when you first meet Paul, his name's not Paul at all. Rather, it's Saul. And you'll remember that Saul is standing there at the stoning of that early Christian martyr. That stoning of Stephen, the one who is giving his life for the witness that he had. But through it all, he remained true. And to be fair, when you meet Saul, he's not casting the stones. No, he's standing there. The cloaks, he's holding the cloaks to the people who are throwing the stones. It's almost as though we watch as the blood of Stephen splatters upon his sandals. Saul has a grin of approval upon his face. He is so determined. You've got to understand who he is. He comes from the right family. He's gone to the right schools. He's sat under the right teachers. He's headed for greatness. He was headed for a seat in the ruling body of the Jewish people, the Sanhedrin. Everything was going his way. And this new way of Christianity, this man named Jesus, everything about it rubbed against him the wrong way. So much so that he gets permission from the higher-ups to go to a particular area, to go to a particular religion, and gather up everybody who claimed the name of Jesus. Anybody who claimed to be of that way, he would cause to pay. See, we talk about terrorism as if it's something new. But what you've got to see in this moment, Saul is a religious terrorist. It doesn't matter, male, female, child. It doesn't matter what their age. He's going down the road in a murderous rampage. His neck is red. His face is blotchy. And all of a sudden, in the midst of it all, he runs into something he wasn't expecting. See, Saul had bought into the lie. Saul had believed that this man named Jesus had died on a cross. And let me be assured, we're coming up on Easter. That's not a lie. Jesus did give his life, and he did die upon a cross. Saul believed that Jesus was placed into a tomb. That's not a lie either, because Jesus was placed in a tomb. But we all know tonight it was a borrowed tomb. He's not going to be there long. Saul believed under the guise of darkness that some of his followers came and stole away the body with a bribe, stole away the body to perpetuate this myth that Jesus was alive. But today, as he's on a murderous rampage, today as he's going down a street in fury, he runs into the living Christ, and that reality brings him to his knees. And it's almost in that moment that Jesus, I'm a visual thinker, reaches down into a chest of a man, gets a hold of his heart, turns him around 180 degrees. And where Saul wanted to put an end to the name of Jesus being spread, now all of a sudden Paul won't shut up about the man. He's talking about Jesus everywhere he goes. Where Saul wanted to put an end to the early church, where he wanted to close those things, now Paul is going around starting churches everywhere he goes. Amen. Saul, where he wanted to kill believers, now he's responsible for birthing believers everywhere. I want you to see, Paul was more passionate about the cause of Christ than Saul was about putting an end to it. And I just want to put this out there. I wish that I had a little bit of Paul's passion. I do. I mean, he was a weird dude. Wouldn't you have loved to have hung around him? He was strange, man. He would go to places and he would preach to them, and they wouldn't like what he had to say. I know how that feels. Do you know how that feels? Other preachers, you know how that feels. You'd go and you'd preach to them, and then they wouldn't like it, so what would they do? They'd beat him half to death. Read it. They'd stone him and leave him for dead. Then you know what Paul would do? He'd get up, brush the dust off of him, lick his wounds, and go preach to those people again. Honey, that's weird. I'm going to tell you. Had you have beat me up Sunday afternoon, I promise you, I'd have not been back Sunday night. And I might have just fought back a little bit. I mean, I does this kind of thing. And I promise you, I'd have made you famous everywhere I go. I talk about the United Church of the Nazarene, my foot. I'll tell them how much you love Jesus. But Paul, would go and preach to those people. Why? Because this is what he'd say. He'd say, necessity is laid upon me. Woe is me if I fail to preach. See, there was this fire that was burning down in his belly. He had to share Jesus. So that's what he did. Well, he had an incredible ministry, an incredible life. But when he's coming down to the end, we find him as he's sitting there in a Roman prison. He's sitting there in a Roman jail, and he's been there before. But there's something about this time, there's something about this day that he realizes that this is going to be the end. Ultimately, he's going to give his life for the Christ that he served. Don't pity him. Don't pity him. Why? Because this is what you realize for the child of God, eternity has begun. Do you understand that? For the child of God, eternity has begun. We're just living for that day that we're forever in His presence. Hey, you can't threaten me with heaven. You can't. Think about that. I mean, we are living, and Paul says to live is Christ and to die is gain. He's living for this moment. But as he's sitting there in that damn dungeon, he begins to think about a young man that he had poured his life into. He begins to think about Timothy, a man that he had mentored. And now Timothy is off pastoring somewhere. And there are some things, in order for the cause of Christ to advance, there are some things that are burning upon him. And he realizes that this is going to be his last opportunity to encourage. It's going to be his last chance to give him these words. So Paul sits down and he begins to pen the letter that we refer to as 2 Timothy. And I'll just tell you, he opens it up. We won't take a long time. You're saying you already took a long time. That's all right. He opens it up, and the first thing he says in verse 3, he says, Timothy, I want you to know, night and day, I'm praying for you. Night and day, I'm praying for you, Timothy. And I'll not pause here long, but can I just say this? That's an amazing way for Paul to start this letter. I've tried to tell you in a poor way how important this letter is. This is the last communication from a teacher to his student. From the mentor to the mentee. What do you say? What's the one being mentored? Whatever that word is, you know. And I think if I were going to write a letter, I'll bring it to our day. I appreciate your pastor. Do you appreciate your pastor? You know what I appreciate most about him? His wife and kids. No, if I were to write something to your pastor about the United Church, if there were some things, now I would never do this, I've never pastored a day in my life, but if for some reason I thought there were some things that I needed to express to him in order for the cause of Christ to advance here in Albany, Kentucky, I'd sit down and I'd write the letter. I'd start by saying, Dave, do this, do this, do this, stop doing this. Why on earth would you ever have thought that this would have worked? Be sure and do this. And by the way, keep doing this. And then at the end, I'd sign to him. I'd say love and prayers. Hey, buddy. I'd say love and prayers. And then I might say, you know, that kind of thing. Whose is this? He's trying to get away. Well, listen. I'd get to all the important things first. I'd get to the heart of the matter. And then I'd save the pleasantries unto the end. Whether I loved him or prayed for him at all, it's the Christian thing to do. I'd say love and prayers and then sign my name. That's my personality. But I want you to notice the first thing Paul says, I'm praying for you. And we don't have time to stay here very long. But could it be the secret to Paul's success in his ministry? I think we can say it like that. Is that he didn't view prayer as a pleasantry. Oh, I'm convicted of that. Because I don't mind telling you, I don't pray enough. I don't mind telling you that because you don't either. See, there was a day in the holiness movement, our heart's cry, our shout was, get the glory down. There were people who would gather together and they would pray until the glory came down. And then when the glory came down, they would pray to keep the glory down. But see, the problem is today, you want to blame the lack of intensity in church service on a worship style. You want to blame it on what translation you use to preach out of. I'll tell you what the problem is with church today. There aren't any people that pray like they used to. You try to call a prayer meeting in most circles and see who shows up. You find how many churches actually call a certain meeting a prayer meeting. They don't do it very often. Why? Because no one will come. Our prayer ministry has been reduced down to calling on someone else to pray for us. To have the pastor pray or the youth pastor pray or calling the prayer chain. But here's the deal. We need to become people of prayer. If we're ever going to see the power of God revealed again in our day, it's not going to be because of soapboxes we get on. It's going to be because we have spent time in prayer. We've gone before Him, and He has heard and answered. He's promised us that He will hear our prayer if we would cry out to Him. Well, that's how He begins. He says, I'm praying for you. And then He says, when I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which first dwelt in your grandmother and in your mother, and I'm persuaded it's in you as well. I want you to catch that phrase. And since I'm going home, it doesn't matter if you come back tomorrow night or not. I'll just keep going. When I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith. Now, I don't know how you are, middle Kentucky, south central Kentucky, you seem a little less hillbilly than my people are. Honestly, I mean, you do. I've been bragging. You guys are a little bit more sophisticated. Some of you are way too serious. They're my people. What does it matter if I call them that? But anyhow, I didn't grow up using words like feign. In fact, when I hear feign, it sounds like something you need to clean yourself up out after. You hit it feign. I didn't know what, and I've always been taught that if you don't know what a particular word means, I mean, even mom and dad told me this. My school teachers told me this. My college professor. If you don't know what a word means, that the best course of action is this. Consult Webster. Hear me? Look it up in the dictionary before you use that word. Otherwise, you might be saying something you don't intend to say. And I have done that many times. Can I get anybody else like that? This time, though, I fell back on my training because I really wanted to know what Paul was saying. So I grabbed Webster, I blew the dust off of the top of it, and I opened it up to the F's because that's where feign is. And when I found the word, this is how it was defined. To feign is to fabricate. To feign is to make a false claim. To feign is to put on a front. In good old-fashioned down-home language, to feign is to be a fake. And I want you to understand what Paul is saying. this great father of the church, responsible for 2/3 of our New Testament. Had it not been for Paul, we wouldn't have known about Timothy. And I want you to hear what he has to say. And remember, he had seen Timothy in the good times, but he had been with Timothy in bad times. He had been with Timothy when the world was on their side. He was with Timothy when the world was against him. He was with Timothy inside church. He was with Timothy outside church. And looking back on the time that they'd spent together, he was able to recall the life that Timothy lived. And he said, when I think about your relationship with Jesus, when I think about the claim on your life that you made, I want you to understand something, Timothy. I remember how real you were. Your relationship with Jesus, it wasn't something you just did on Sunday morning. Your relationship with Jesus, it wasn't just the way you acted when you were around a certain crowd. No, Timothy, you were the same no matter where you are. When we had much, you held to Jesus. But when the world was against us, you held to Jesus. When I think about your life, when I think about your relationship, I remember how real, I remember how genuine, I remember how authentic, I remember how transparent you were. You were real, Timothy. I don't know what that does to you. But I'm telling you, traveling now, going into my 19th year, there have been a lot of things that people have said about me, and some of them might have been true. And I've thought about some of the things, and I think, brother, as well as I know my heart, that's what I want somebody to say about me someday. I want the people that know me better than I know myself. My mom, my neighbors. I want them to say, you know what? Billy not only preached it Sunday through Wednesday, but he lived it Thursday, Friday, Saturday as well. I want you to be able to say, I don't want you to say, yeah, no, Billy came around every now and then and he preached. He was a weird guy. I can handle it. I want you to say, you know what? He was the real deal. Can I ask you something, and I'll keep moving? And I want you to be real because you know the answer to this. More importantly, you know that He knows the answer. What would the person who knows you as well as you know yourself say? Mom and Dad, what would the kids say? Because you do realize they see the way you act here, but then they hear what you say when you close the car door. They hear the way you interact with everybody here, but then they hear the way you speak to their mother in private. Wow. Or the way you speak to their father in private. They watch the soapboxes you get on when you're around certain crowds, but then they watch what you watch on television. What would they say? Hey, Mama and Papa, or Nana and Papa, whatever you call yourself. What would your grandkids say about you? Now, I'm not married and I don't have kids, so that's not fair. So if you're like me, what would your closest friends say? Guys, the people at school, the ones who know you better, I want somebody to say I was real. That's what he's saying. I want you to follow the progression. I'm praying for you, Timothy. You've been real. You've been the real deal. I've watched your life. He says you come from a good, godly heritage. It was in your grandmother. It was in your mother, and I'm persuaded it's in you. You come from good stock. Why is this important? Because we have been prayed for. The ones that have gone before have prayed for us. There are people in my life that pray for me. You've likely got people that pray for you. We've been real in the Church of the Nazarene. More importantly, we've been real in the Church of Jesus Christ. We've taken stands. We've been the people He's called us to be. We have a godly heritage. Because I pray for you, Timothy, and this is what we're getting to. Because I pray for you, because you've been the real deal, because you come from a strong heritage, therefore I put thee in remembrance that thou stir up the gift of God. that you rekindle the embers, that you fan into flame, that you kindle afresh. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but a power of sound. All that kind of thing. That's what we love to get. But don't skip the phrase that prefaces it. I remind you. You got to hear it. Because I pray for you, because you've been real, because you have a godly heritage, I remind you, Timothy, to fan into flame. See, we emphasize the wrong part. Because we live in a day where personal responsibility no one knows anything about. And all you have to do, I mean, where else can you find grown people just lying on a platform and fussing back and forth, saying I didn't say this when it's there on camera that you said it? I mean, from the highest up in our country to the low, I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican. Hey, I'm Christian first and foremost. But nobody in either party can take responsibility for anything. And instead of us standing up and saying our yes is yes and our no is no, what we have done is we've become just like they have. So much so that we want to say the reason why our church is dead is because of this guy. Or the reason why my kid's not saved is because of this guy. Or the reason why we don't have a better attendance is because of this kind of music. We can't take responsibility for everything. And here's the gospel truth. You are the only one that can be responsible for your level of spiritual intensity. There comes a time that you have to grow up and take responsibility for your own relationship. It's not your husband's problem. It's not your wife's problem. It's not your mom or dad's problem. It's not the preacher problem. It's your problem. Because you're the one that is responsible for fanning your own flame. That's what Paul's saying. He's not saying, make sure that this book gets you all stirred up. Make sure you buy the latest Rising Sun CD because that'll really get you going. No. He says, if it's going to happen, Timothy, you've had it. There's no question. If it's going to happen, you've got to take responsibility. You've got to do whatever it takes to burn brighter than you ever have. So I want to ask you, you've been very patient with me. I want to ask you, how brightly are you burning? Honestly, in a moment of transparency, and the Lord would want to distract you, but this is serious business. Are you closer to Him right now than you've ever been? Are you more turned on about Jesus and sharing His love with a world that needs to know? Because if you look back and you think those were better days, you're in danger. We don't live on yesterday. Thank God for yesterday. We live today, and we should burn as brightly as we ever have. You know, don't you? You know. More importantly, you know that He knows, and He's been knowing. And I don't know what the Lord is trying to do here, because it's obvious He's been moving over these last few days. And isn't there something in you that wants to get in on what He's about to do? Isn't there something in you that says, I don't want to live on yesterday. I want to be as close as I've ever been. Who's man or woman enough? There's room up here. I don't know what we're waiting for. If you're not as close, we need to do something about it.